In 1912, a man named Benjamin Guggenheim boarded the Titanic. He was one of the wealthiest passengers on the ship, worth tens of millions of dollars in today's money. When the ship began sinking, witnesses later said he calmly changed into his finest evening clothes and reportedly told a steward, "We are dressed in our best and prepared to go down like gentlemen." It sounds dramatic, but the interesting part isn't the ending of the story, it's what happened before it. Guggenheim and the other wealthy passengers on that ship lived in a completely different world than the rest of the people on board. They had different cabins, different dining rooms, different access, and even different lifeboat priorities. Same ship, same destination, completely different treatment. Money quietly changes the rules around you, not all at once and not in the way most people imagine, but in stages. There are certain financial thresholds where the system around you begins to behave differently. Banks treat you differently. Employers treat you differently. Opportunities begin appearing that never existed before. Most people never realize these thresholds exist, which is why so many people spend decades working hard and still feel like the math of life never quite works in their favor. I spend a lot of time thinking about how wealth actually works, not the motivational version you see online, but the mathematical and psychological reality behind it. And once you start studying it, you begin to notice that wealth building isn't one smooth curve upward. It's more like crossing invisible lines. When you pass one of these lines, the game changes. The strategies that worked before stop working the same way, and new advantages appear that didn't exist previously. Over centuries of history and decades of financial data, 3 of these thresholds appear again and again. The first one is the point where money finally starts to breathe. For most people in today's economy, that number sits somewhere around $100,000 in invested assets. Not total assets, not including your car or the furniture in your apartment, but actual invested capital. Money that is in the market, working whether you are awake or asleep. Below that level, wealth building feels almost invisible. You save, you invest a little, and months go by without feeling like anything meaningful has changed. The math technically works, but psychologically it feels pointless. Imagine having $10,000 invested and earning roughly 8% in a year. That's about $800. It's nice, but it barely registers in your life. Scale that up to $50,000 and now you might earn $4,000 in a year. Better, but still fragile. A few bad weeks in the market can erase months of growth. It still feels like you're pushing the boulder uphill mostly by yourself. But once someone crosses roughly $100,000 invested, something subtle shifts. That same 8% now produces $8,000 per year. Suddenly, the portfolio itself starts contributing something noticeable. You check your account and the number actually moves. A good month might add several $1,000s. A bad month might subtract a few thousand, but you know it will recover over time. The account starts to feel alive instead of stagnant. The most important change at that level isn't the math though, it's the psychology. When your investments begin generating a noticeable fraction of your annual income, your relationship with work changes slightly. If someone earns $70,000 per year and their investments produce $8,000 on their own, that's more than 10% of their salary being generated by capital instead of labor. It's not enough to quit a job, but it loosens the psychological pressure. Suddenly, employment feels a little more like a choice and a little less like a trap. That first stage is brutally difficult to reach. The journey from 0 to 100,000 often takes longer than any other stretch of the wealth building process. It can take 7 to 10 years of consistent saving for someone with a normal income. Month after month contributing a few $100s, watching the progress crawl forward slowly. Many people give up in this phase because the growth feels too small to justify the sacrifice. But those who survive it unlock the second threshold. Around $500,000 invested, something else changes. At that level, the portfolio begins generating serious income. Using a conservative 4% withdrawal assumption, $500,000 can produce roughly $20,000 per year indefinitely. That's not luxury money, but it represents something much more powerful than comfort. It represents security.
Security is the ability to survive without panic. Someone with $500,000 invested can lose their job and still have time to breathe. They can take months to find the right opportunity instead of grabbing the first paycheck available. They can negotiate harder, leave toxic environments, or retrain for a better career path. That kind of leverage changes how someone moves through the world. Employers sense this difference whether they realize it or not. People who don't desperately need their paycheck behave differently. They speak more honestly. They negotiate more confidently. They take smarter risks. Ironically, this often makes them more valuable professionally because they aren't operating from fear. The math begins accelerating at this stage as well. At 8% returns, $500,000 produces roughly $40,000 per year in growth. That means the portfolio itself is now doing more work than most people's annual contributions. The capital becomes your most productive employee, working 24 hours a day without complaint. But there is a final threshold where the equation flips completely. Somewhere around $2.5 million invested, the relationship between time and money begins to invert. At that level, even a conservative 6% return produces roughly $150,000 per year. For many people, that is equal to or greater than their working salary. When capital generates more wealth than labor, the rules change entirely. Time stops being the most valuable resource you have. Capital becomes the dominant engine. Working longer hours to earn additional income starts to make less sense mathematically because your investments may already be producing more than those extra hours of labor. This is why truly wealthy people often behave so differently than everyone else. It's not always about laziness or privilege, it's often just arithmetic. When a portfolio generates hundreds of dollars every single day regardless of effort, the incentive structure changes. But the path to that third threshold rarely comes from wages alone. Ownership usually becomes the key. Equity in businesses, real estate, or investments that grow faster than simple savings. Salaries can build the foundation, but ownership is often what pushes people across the final line. What makes these thresholds so powerful is that they are invisible to most people. The financial world spends enormous energy focusing on income, promotions, and consumption. Very little attention is given to the strategic milestones where wealth begins behaving differently. Yet once you see these lines clearly, your priorities begin to change. Instead of chasing constant lifestyle upgrades, the focus becomes crossing the next threshold, surviving the slow early phase, protecting the middle stage, and eventually positioning yourself for ownership and long-term capital growth. The strange truth is that wealth building often feels hardest right before it begins working. The first stage feels like filling a massive swimming pool with a garden hose. For hours, nothing seems to change, just a shallow puddle at the bottom. But once the water level rises high enough, every additional gallon becomes visible progress. The people who eventually build real wealth are rarely the ones who make the most brilliant investment decisions. They are usually the ones who simply keep the hose running long enough to reach the first visible level. Once that happens, the system begins helping them. And from that point forward, the game of money starts playing very differently. The truth is that building wealth rarely happens through one brilliant decision. It happens through years of small, boring, consistent actions, saving regularly, investing consistently, and letting the flywheel spin. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Which milestone are you currently working toward right now? The first $100,000? The $500,000 level of real financial security, or the $2.5 million inversion point where your money begins working harder than you do? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy learning about money, discipline, and financial freedom, consider subscribing. I post simple lessons like this every week.